So I packed up all my backpacking gear, charged up all of my electric skateboard batteries, got dropped off at the trailhead, and set off on a overnight backpacking trip on my new electric mountain board. And I made it about halfway to my first stop before I completely ran out of batteries and had to bail only a couple hours in. So what happened? Well, the moral of the story is that terrain matters a lot. And one of the things that affects terrain is the time of year, and I went on this trip in early spring. You can imagine where this is going. Now, I didn't go into this trip completely blind to that fact, but I figured that the trails would still be somewhat hard and easily rideable even if it had a wet layer of gravel and silt on top. And as it turned out, that was a very bad assumption to make. Because there was so much water saturating the ground, it actually made the normally hard-packed gravel rail trail soft and mushy and almost spongy, and it was basically acting like glue to the skateboard's wheels, almost like a suction cup effect. It was nowhere near the condition that it is in summertime where it's really hard and tamped down, and even a street board could ride on it. And the condition of this trail made me burn through almost 750 watt hours of battery in 16 kilometers. It's that time of year where it's right in that unfortunate zone where it's not cold enough where the ground is actually frozen solid, making it easy to ride on, and it hasn't warmed up enough where all of the saturated water has baked off and let it get to its normal summertime state. I did actually think about trying to continue on with my trip, but I really was not looking forward to playing hike-a-board for the remaining 14 kilometers to my first stop. I mean, it was still pretty early on in the day, and I was planning on spending the night at that first stop anyways, but even if I did that, it's alright, like, what about the next leg and the one after that? My whole trip plan was predicated on some clearly screwy math, so I would have needed to recalculate everything. And it's not like the electric skateboard itself wasn't up to the task. It's an all-terrain board with 8-inch knobbly tires. And there was another issue I ran into. When I switched to my second battery of the 3 I brought with me, I realized I was going super slow compared to the other batteries. And eventually I figured out that the small battery pack is actually amp limited in its max amp output, which really crippled my speed and torque. So going forward, I'll need to make sure that the batteries I use with this have a high max amp output of at least 20 amps, especially for rough trails like this. So this was my battery setup for this trip. I had my experimental sodium ion battery and 2 lithium ion packs. The larger of the 2 lithium batteries is roughly 324 watt hours, and the amp gimped little guy is about 290 watt hours, minus any degradation these packs have since they're a couple years old. And including the sodium ion battery, it's about a total usable capacity of about 750 watt hours. And the thing with this experimental sodium ion battery that I was using is that it already has only half the energy density of lithium-ion batteries, but on top of that, you only get to use the top end of the charge on a sodium-ion battery, because once it reaches about halfway, it just loses any ability to provide any meaningful power to accelerate forward. So if you do the math, that works out that it's about 4 times the size of a similar usable capacity lithium-ion battery. So the sodium-ion battery is fun for experimental rides and that sort of thing, but when it comes to actually trying to make distance on these backpacking type trips, I think I'm going to go with a purely lithium setup going forward, especially on these rough trails that really eat through batteries quickly. So the crux of the problem is that I used all my battery capacity in a very short time span, and my solution to that range issue is to literally double my battery capacity while keeping the same 30 kilometers in between charging stops. And there's plenty of room in the battery box to house them. Essentially, the sodium ion battery comes out, and 2 of these 360 watt hour high amp output batteries go in its place, which is nice because these batteries are actually made for this board. That brings my battery capacity up to 1,334 watt hours, or about 28 kilometers of range on the trail conditions I faced. So obviously I'll be running 4 batteries now instead of 3, but if I include my small charger for that 4th battery that may or may not be used, I'm really not looking at that much more time spent on my charging stops compared to my normal setup. It goes from 3 hours to a little bit more because of the larger batteries. And that's the worst case scenario. If I wind up on really smooth and easily rideable trails that only use like half of my available battery capacity, if I manage my battery swaps effectively, I might only have to stop and charge for an hour and a half, 2 hours at most. Whenever I face failures like this, I always like to sit down and really think through what went wrong and how to fix it going forward. And now that I have my updated setup, I'm really looking forward to getting out there and finishing that trip.